This is the Humans of Gaming podcast, an open and honest conversation about games, life, and belief.
Welcome to Humans of Gaming. I'm Drew Dixon. I am the chief content nerd at Love Thy Nerd and host of this podcast. Unfortunately, Chris Gwaltney couldn't make it with us today, so it's just me and my special guest, which today is Heidi McDonald. Hey, Heidi, how are you?
Hey, I'm great. It's a little cold outside, but that's all right.
We're making it.
Yeah.
I was a little bummed because here in Nashville, like, we don't get that much snow, but anytime it's like cold and snowy elsewhere, it's cold and rainy here.
Yeah.
It's just like kind of wet and gloomy, and then I can't ever go like mountain biking, which stinks. So yeah, I know.
Well, there's always the Wii. You know, you can find some kind of like mountain bike on the Wii or something.
Yeah, there's some mountain biking games. I've never tried them really, but there are a few. Maybe I should do that. So.
I think that's probably the only mountain biking I'd ever be able to do. Because I'm about to tell you a horrible secret. I don't know how to ride a bicycle.
Oh my goodness. You need to come to Nashville and I'll teach you.
Okay. That'd be fun. Yeah, we lived, not only am I notoriously a klutz, but we lived at the top of a hill in Pittsburg, and so my parents didn't think it was safe to put me on a bike.
Yeah,
and that makes sense. That was probably wise of them in retrospect, but I don't.
They loved you. They were just looking out for you.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's great.
But if the zombie apocalypse comes and the only means of escape is bicycles, I guess I'll be laying down my life for you all.
Well, you know, my 7-year, we were talking about our kids earlier before we started the podcast. I tried probably 3 or 4 times to teach my daughter to ride her bike without training wheels, you know, and she just wasn't having it. And I just kind of went, fine. I mean, I'm not going to try to teach her because she's not receptive, right, to this, and it's not going well. And you know, one day she just picked it up and did it herself. So maybe if the zombies were coming after you, you'd like pick up the bike and you'd figure it out.
I don't know. That'd be interesting. Maybe it'd be one of those, if I actually play a mountain biking game, then I'd be able to do it. Because it's like you hear those news stories about some 12-year-old kid who was able to save his grandma's life by pulling the car over because he'd played Mario Kart or some kind of crazy crap like that.
Yeah. There was I don't know if it's really true, but there's some story about that with like Grand Theft Auto, that some kid knew how to drive a car because of Grand Theft Auto or something.
Wow.
But I don't know. It's probably not true. But Heidi, where what would people know you from? You've worked on several games and done several things in the gaming industry. How do you introduce yourself when it comes to your contribution to the world of video games?
Well, I worked as a designer and a writer for Shell Games in Pittsburg for 4.5 years. I did 9 titles with them. Several of them were transformational or educational games. Like we did one that was an HIV prevention game. We did a drug prevention game. We did a literacy game. I also worked while I was there on this funny little Star Trek parody game called Orion Trail. Like, think about Oregon Trail except in space and with a lot of really bad Star Trek jokes. So I think people liked that one. So I'd done a lot of that kind of stuff. They also know me from writing. I've written a book called Digital Love, Romance and Sexuality in Games, and I've done a lot of lecturing and independent research on that topic about like how and why people romance when they're playing single player RPGs. Yeah. And I also wear pirate hats at conferences. And so it's like they'll see the lady with the huge hat. And they'll be like, oh yeah, there she goes. And it started completely by accident, that whole thing. But now if I don't wear a hat, people get mad at me and they're like, where's your hat? Recently, I was the senior creative director for an organization called iThrive, which uses games to promote positive psychology.
Wow.
In other words, figuring out best practices to deliberately design for things like empathy and optimism and stuff like that. And I just wrapped up work with them a couple weeks ago, so I'm sniffing around trying to figure out what I'm going to do next. But I'm really super proud of the work that I got to do with them, and
Yeah, that's cool.
it'll be cool.
So if you're listening to this, hire Heidi.
Yeah,
to do
thank you.
Do some narrative stuff for your game, or there's some writing for your game. What else would you? Let's do your resume right here. Let's get you hired. Let's get you hired right now.
That's awesome. Yeah, I could also work on romance, or if you have a game that's about romance, I can look at it and say, oh well, here's how this lines up with what I've learned from my research. And I can also talk about things like empathy and kindness and stuff like that, but I wouldn't want to run contractually afoul of them, those guys, because they're really good at what they do, and they're a bunch of scientists and stuff. But I did learn an awful lot from working there. A little bit about emotional engagement.
Here's my pitch to any studio that's like listening to this podcast for you. Is that like scientists can be kind of like, I'm sure the scientists at iThrive are great, but they can be kind of like stuffy and not so like intellectual, but you're fun to talk to.
Thank you. Yeah,
so
my
they
job
can hire you to speak into that issue of empathy and kind of to speak that issue into their games without having to talk to someone who like is hard to talk to and kind of stuffy.
Well, no, that's kind of what my role was on the team. I was the one game person on the entire team of scientists. And the biggest part of my job there was translation, because we don't always understand the science speak, and the scientists don't always understand game developers. Like when we were having an event for game developers and they said, well, what snacks should we have? And I said, we should have a lot of bacon, and they're like, wait, what? And I'm like, no, trust me, bacon, it's a thing. And James Port now shows up and piles his plate completely with bacon. And I'm like, yeah, score.
That's great. Well, actually, I'm curious to talk to you about both those subjects of love and romance in games, and then also empathy. I'd be curious, like in the studies and things that you've done to write Digital Love was the name of the game, or the name of the book, right?
Yeah, Digital Love, Romance and Sexuality in Games. It's a collection of essays from people throughout the games industry who are examining one specific piece or part of something. Like we have somebody who wrote an essay about marriage in Stardew Valley, for example. And
interesting.
My chapter in my own book has to do with the bizarro relationship in Western culture about nudity in games.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's, how do you present nudity with the NPCs and what's appropriate and what's not. But there's this really weird psychological stuff that happens whenever people are watching their own character be naked in a game.
Yeah.
Like
what happens? They find that odd, or?
Well, okay. So I was playing Dragon Age Inquisition, and there was a love scene, and after the love scene, my character, who I designed to look kind of like me, was laying back in breathless relief, and her boobs are hanging out, right? And I got kind of mad, because I was like, I have better boobs than this character does. And it's like, I want my boobs to look like my boobs. And it was like this whole thing about my boobs. And there's also this character named Morrigan who was present in Dragon Age Origins and then was present again in Dragon Age Inquisition. Well, 10 years have passed between those two, and her boobs disappeared. Like, I've taken screenshots to prove, like, put them side by side, and like, she's got these huge boobs in Dragon Age Origins, and then in Dragon Age Inquisition it's like they've gone down to like B cups or something, like B or even A. And I'm like, well, what does that say about aging, and what does that say about motherhood? Because like Morrigan has become a mom, and it's like, Dude, in my experience,
So you actually think this was intentional on their part?
I don't know if it was a thing about the rigging or the animation or,
Yeah.
clothing logistics. I don't know the reasons behind the decision, but her boobs are clearly smaller. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
in my personal experience, your boobs don't shrink when you have babies.
Mhm.
The opposite thing happens, right? The thing
Right.
people have asked me, if you were ever going to make a mod for Dragon Age Inquisition, what would you make? Well, one of the ones I'd make is give Morrigan her boobs back.
Yeah. You could probably get some gamers behind that.
Yeah, maybe.
That mod. There's
But-
probably someone out there who would do that for you.
Yeah, there was also this really incredible thing that happened. There was a game called Rust, where in the beginning when they released it, it was just male characters, and they dropped you into the world naked, and you're naked. And they randomized your character's penis size based on your Steam ID, right? So
Okay.
there was a big outcry because you couldn't choose what race you were, and also because you couldn't choose your penis size in the game. And like the developers took an awful lot of crap from people about that. And I read this.
I had no idea about this.
Yeah,
I've seen that game. I didn't know there was a controversy about. Frustration about this.
And there was a guy who wrote an article, and I have it in my book. I don't remember his name of the article right this minute, but he wrote this really incredible article about his journey of self-discovery, of doing everything he could do within the game to figure out his character's penis size. And it involved...
Wow.
He's like walking around trying to see if he can see his reflection. And it was like this big elaborate thing until finally he ends up like standing on top of a rock when the sun was exactly in a certain position. And like it leads up to this big dramatic moment where he realizes, oh my God, he's got the tiniest penis ever. And like how it brought up all of these feelings in this guy. And it's funny though, because in the game Rust, if you have a smaller member, you can run faster, whereas if you've been awarded a larger member, you take damage there easier and you run a little bit slower. So
there's not really any tactical advantage here.
No, it is purely just messing
aesthetic.
With your feelings. Yeah.
Right.
So
aesthetic and psychologically emotional.
Yeah, exactly. And so, there's all this stigma and all this shame around like nudity. And I'm not even talking about, adult games or hentai. That's something completely different. I'm just talking about regular games that have like nudity. It dredges up all this stuff for people. And and that's what my chapter talks about. But there's a lot of cool chapters in there. We had Dr. Luke Dickin, who's a good friend of mine. He is the data guy at Zynga. He wrote an essay about the ethics of romance and sexuality in AI.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So there's a lot of cool things in the book.
Yeah. I'm curious if because I feel like romance in games always feels a little bit awkward at best. Is there a game? Are there games that you feel like do it really like handle romance in really like helpful or interesting ways?
Well,
that you would highlight?
There are. First of all, there's a division between what the Eastern market considers a romance game and what the Western market considers a romance game. The Eastern market, they've already put their flag in the ground. They're like, we're about dating sims and we're about hentai. That's what that means to us. But when I was asking players, game scholars, developers, I asked everybody.
For our listeners, do you want to say like define our terms here? When you say hentai, that means like these are like animated pornographic games,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Okay.
And there's quite a lot of that stuff out there. But that hasn't been what I researched. I've been researching more of the dating aspect of it, and the not adult category, if you will.
Right. So mostly you've dug into Western games that have romance systems in them.
Yeah.
It's like Mass Effect and
yeah,
Dragon
and like what's
Age
really, really exciting is that I asked all of these folks, what phrase romance game mean to you? And nobody knows. There's no clear consensus on it. And I think that's exciting because that means we get to decide what it means.
Yeah, there you go.
I would love to see a AAA studio make the romance the center content instead of the side content. It's like, do this game where the romance is the central thing that like spirals out and changes the world. And I think if you had a game like that, you would have so many people buy it. Be like, wow, where did that come from?
Yeah, it's surprising that we haven't, because I mean, obviously our culture, we live in a culture that's obsessed with the idea of romance. It's weird that it's just kind of something that is tacked on to, not tacked on, I shouldn't say, that's not fair. It's an aspect of a lot of games in the West, but it's never the driving force.
No, I've seen it presented a few different ways. You've got ones that are pretty much just contingent on dialogue trees. You've got ones that are like in Stardew Valley. It's like, if you buy this dude enough cookies, he'll marry you, kind of thing.
Which is not always, it's not necessarily untrue. That happens.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've never actually estimated how many cupcakes it would take to buy me off, but cupcakes, man. I'm saying.
Yeah, they're powerful.
Yeah,
they have capital.
Cupcakes are important, so. and then there are other mechanics that I've seen, like in the Persona series, where it colors the game mechanics. Your relationship with other people colors the game mechanics in ways that are deeper than, okay, Alistair's your boyfriend, so now you get this special buff, or you get this bigger sword.
Yeah. Right.
So it can be story-based, it can be mechanics-based, it can be some combination of story and mechanics-based. I'm seeing dating sims are starting to really take off here in the United States. The stuff that Pixelberry's doing with choices.
And what have they done? Pixelberry?
They're doing a game called Choices, which is really popular with young people, where it's just kind of a visual novel style thing where you get to make choices. Right. Unbelievable that a game named Choices would have choices, but they're romance games, and they have my friend Jennifer Hepler, who actually wrote for Dragon Age, is writing for Choices now. So they're doing some pretty cool stuff over there. But nice. it's I think that's the closest that we're seeing in the West to the Eastern dating sim is what Pixelberry's doing. And then you have, your Dragon Age, your Mass Effect, the stuff that BioWare's doing. And when I asked players what were your favorite romances in games, 3 of the top 5 were BioWare titles. So any conversation about romance in games in the Western market has got to include BioWare in it, because they're very well recognized for that. And I started researching all of this stuff just based on the fact that
you're into those games.
I played Dragon Age Origins, and I ended up playing. I was the nerd who played Dragon Age 3 times completely through the game in order to get my romance with Alistair to turn out the way I wanted it to.
Yeah, wow.
Because it's like you get to the end, it's like, what do you mean I can't marry him? That's not fair.
That's some serious commitment to Dragon Age.
Yeah, most people know that I'm like a unrepentant Dragon Age fangirl. That's like my jam right there is Dragon Age. I could go nuts. Like, it's to the point where now people expect my obligatory Alistair slide in all my conference talks, because they just know that it's like Dragon Age.
I need a Dragon Age game that's just the relationship stuff, because I actually find that to be really interesting and engaging in there. I think, like with Dragon Age Inquisition, I got bogged down. I just didn't like, and it's probably me, I probably just have issues, but I just didn't like the combat.
No,
And
that's
so
fair. I mean, I've heard some other people say that, but I really am somebody who loves the tactics. I love the ability to like hit the space bar and like assign people, you go do this, now you go do that.
Right.
That's something that I really liked. But I play BioWare stuff for the story. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. The thing I loved about that game was also like, not only are you juggling this romance stuff, but you're like trying to figure out, am I really like this messianic figure?
Yeah.
Do I really like, that was an interesting thing that they asked players to sort of grapple with. Am I going to view myself as a messiah or not? And, you know, you could role play that any way you wanted to, I guess, but
well, you know, you said,
pretty fun.
A Dragon Age game with just the romance. They did an April Fool's joke a few years ago where they put up an advertisement on April Fool's Day for a card game that was about breeding nugs. And I was like,
wow.
You guys, that is so not fair. This game needs to exist because I would play the shit out of it.
That's funny.
Yeah.
That's great.
I was like, you can name it I Nugnu.
There you go. No, that's perfect. Somebody should do that. Or at least like EA should give someone the rights to do it.
Yeah.
That would be good.
Well, hey, you know, I'm not busy right now.
Yeah, they should hire you. You would hit that out of the park.
Although, you know what though, every time I've ever seen a writer's position come up for Dragon Age, it's like people, I get like 20 different people email it to me within 15 minutes of it going up. And I know that if I did write for Dragon Age, I would absolutely kill it because that's like my jam. But I think that's the one game that I would never want to work on because I need to love it. Yeah. You know, that is the one. Yeah. It's like whenever I've ever been frustrated with the game industry and thinking about leaving, it's always Dragon Age that brings me back. And so I need to love that game, and I don't think I could love it anymore if I worked on it.
Yeah. Yep. I think, as we've seen recently in the news, that I'm sure it's it's working on games a lot of times makes you hate them. That's definitely a truism. So
I've been very lucky in that regard. Really? I haven't. I mean, there are points like just with any job. You know, people are like, "Oh, you know, you're a game designer. You just get to play games all day." It's a little bit more complicated than that. Yeah. But just like with any job, there are things that'll frustrate you about it, and the points of frustration were not ones that were so awful for me that I was like, I hate my life, I hate this project, I hate these people. You know, I've just felt really fortunate, and I've had a lot of fun. Like even at points when you are frustrated, you just kind of take a step back and go, God, I get to work on video games. How damn cool is that?
Yeah, that is cool. Definitely. And so you mentioned, I'm just curious because you mentioned that that 3 of the top 5 romance games that people talk about are BioWare games. What are the other 2?
I don't remember. I'm sorry. I think remember.
Okay.
I don't.
No, I'm just curious. Leisure Suit Larry. That's what it is.
No. I want to say Witcher. Okay. Because
that makes sense. Yeah.
I want to say Witcher, and I don't remember what the other one was, but I know that it wasn't a BioWare. So
yeah.
I don't know. We'll probably have to edit that part out because it's slipping my mind.
No worries. So so you have worked at Shell Games, and you've done a bunch of different projects there, it sounds like. Yeah. What was that like working with? I assumed you got to work some with Jesse Shell. And
yeah.
What was that experience like?
It's so funny, right? Because people will say to me, "Oh my God, what's he like to work with?" And basically, if you've ever seen one of his conference talks, that's exactly who he is. Okay. Like that guy. That's exactly who he is. And it's like the first day that I was ever at that company, you know, I'm sitting at my desk and I'm just kind of trying to figure stuff out. And all of a sudden I see Jesse walk past in a top hat playing a harmonica and juggling. And I'm like, what the heck? Like, what did yeah. And I'm looking over and I'm like, what the hell was that even? And of course, the longer you're there, you realize that that's how he mentally chews through problems. It's like when he is trying to churn something through and figure it out, that's what he does in order to help his process. And so while the first day I was like, what the hell did I just see? 2 weeks later, it's like, oh yeah, there he goes again. And he taught me everything I needed to know about failure. I learned from him. I learned so much from him. I learned a lot about game design. I learned a lot about public speaking because he's a showman. He gets up there and it's like he's funny and he's engaging. And, I took a lot of my conference style from him. I've learned a lot. And but when I say that I learned about failure, it all came down to a certain incident, and that was that there's a gong at Shell Games, and if anyone hits the gong, that means you're supposed to assemble. Like everyone who hears the gong is supposed to show up. And
and anybody can just go hit it. Like, hey,
yeah, but you better
come to me.
Exactly. No, it's like you better have a reason because, like, seriously, the whole company will show up. And on my first day, I was like, "Oh, cool gong. What's that for?" And they, oh my God, we got an intern who asked. I guess I was the first one who asked rather than just hit it. Because, like the interns will be like, oh, cool, gong, and they'll hit it, and then everyone will come running and be like, intern. But I, for some reason, knew, and I was like, the gong, what's that for? They're like, ooh, she asked. You got to watch this one. Well, so one Friday, we all hear the gong, and we're not expecting it, and we all assemble. Turns out the purpose of this meeting on a Friday afternoon was Jesse had bought this turn of the century penny farthing bicycle, like one of those with the huge wheel in the front and the little one in the back, and the thing's like 6 feet tall. And the purpose of this meeting was to watch him ride the penny farthing bicycle around the office.
Nice.
And like,
was he able to?
Well, it took him about 6 tries to get up there because, I mean, this thing is about 6 feet in the air. And I would not. It's braver than I am. We were trying it.
You don't even know how to ride a bike.
No, so. I don't. But see, Jesse is a former circus performer, so he is familiar with riding unicycles. And so it would follow that he'd know how to do this. And so, he was a little wobbly at first, but pretty soon he's like riding this thing triumphantly and he's making laps around the office and people are whooping and holding up their phones and recording the whole thing. Well, at some point, something went horribly wrong and he lost control of the bike. It went slam into the wall. Like, this thing would have gotten a couple million views on YouTube. But it was kind of like, yeah. And then, when all the phones just kind of lower, and we were worried. We're like, oh crap, does he need to go to the hospital or something? But he just kind of stood up, looked around, brushed himself off, and said, that wasn't like riding a unicycle at all. And like, he taught me everything that I needed to know about failure in that moment, right? Because he took a risk. He was fearless. He did it in front of everybody. It's like he made himself vulnerable in front of everybody. And we wanted him to win. And when he didn't, we were still supportive of him when he didn't, because we wanted him to win and we supported him. And it's like, you can handle failure in a few different ways. You can like stay on the ground and like be upset or beat yourself up, or you can do what he did, which is just brush yourself off and be like, well, that sucked. Here's what I learned. And then you go do something else, And I just really admired him so much in that, all the time, but in particularly in that moment, because I was like, God, it was like the biggest, most important life lesson about failure that I've ever gotten was watching that happen.
Yeah, that's interesting because it makes me wonder, and this is kind of a personal question, so do with it what you will, but is there like since that moment, has there been like a formative failure for you that you've really learned from that you might mention?
Well, when I was doing creative direction at iThrive, there was a certain project that I was doing creative direction on that didn't didn't live up to the expectation of what I thought it was going to be. And that was hard, because you take it on yourself. It's like when you're the person who's kind of shepherding all of this, and then all of the right combinations or the wrong combinations, as the case may be, will all go wrong. There's so many moving pieces with the game, right? In order for a game to be successful, you have to have all these little pieces working in tandem together in just the right way. And if one or two of those pieces fall down, then it gunks up everything, and it always depends on what things go wrong and how those things work together. And so it's game making is hard. And that was something that I had no idea of until I got into the games industry, but I beat myself up a lot about that. But it turned out that a couple of the things that went wrong, we could have thought about earlier and maybe mitigated a little bit better, but there were a couple things that just couldn't have been foreseen, and you just have to do some honest soul searching and think about, what was in my control, what wasn't in my control, what could I and should I have anticipated, what was stuff that I never could have anticipated, and just kind of take that knowledge with you into the next project. And I mean, the truth of it is, when you're video games, you are 10 times more likely to fail than you are to succeed. So, I mean, you have to be used to failing. And like Jason Vandenberg, who's the creative studio lead at ArenaNet, has done a really great series of like talks and articles and stuff about how you have to fail faster. And he talks about failure and how to fail faster.
Yeah, I'm going to check this out.
Dude, his work is fantastic. All about player behavior. Check him out. It's actually my hat thing is his fault.
Oh yeah. Nice.
Yeah, because he calls himself the Dark Lord, and you see this guy walking around at conferences, and he's really intimidating looking. He's got all these skull rings on his fingers and stuff like that, and
is he actually intimidating?
No. he's really the nicest guy ever, but I'm told that he can be intimidating, but I've not ever experienced that part of him. He's always been very nice to me. But I was at GDC in, I think it was 2013, and I was given a talk, and I was a conference associate that year, because it's like you can be a volunteer and they give you a free pass in exchange for being a volunteer. And that's how I was able to go to GDC the first couple years. Of the first year, there was a guy there who wore a pirate hat, but it was a really stupid pirate hat. And so the next year I was like, I'm going to outdo that dude's pirate hat. So I wore my swashbuckler, my Three Musketeers with the feathers coming out of it and everything. And because when you're a conference volunteer, it's like wearing hats is just a thing they do. So I had this hat on, and I bump into Jason Vandenberg. He's like, you totally need to wear that hat during your conference talk. And I'm like, what? And he goes, no, I dare you. Well, if anyone else had told me to do it, I'd be like, I don't know about that. But like, dude, when the Dark Lord tells you to do something, you better well do it, And so I wore my swashbuckler hat to my conference talk, and it got picked up in the press. And so there were pictures of me in this hat. And so then it became a thing, and people were like, you're going to wear a hat. And it's like, oh my God. So then the next year, and then I've come up with a different GDC hat every year. I've got a Scottish milliner who builds my hats personally for my head. And it's the one thing that I spend money on every year is my conference hat. So people are like, how did you adopt that gimmick? I'm like, I blame Jason Vandenberg. It's the Dark Lord's fault.
There you go. Nice. That's funny. Well, we do like to get to know our guests a little bit more personally. So we were talking about this earlier, but our listeners don't know. Where did you grow up, and what was that like? What was your upbringing like? I grew up here in Pittsburg, where I live right now. And my
my time in Pittsburgh has been punctuated by, I lived in LA for a couple years just recently, but I've mostly just been in Pittsburgh my whole life. And I grew up at a time right when the steel mills were shutting down in the, in the 80s, and that was really something because the town went through a really big change. It went through this change from being a really dirty steel town to being this really cool place for technology and education and healthcare, but it took like 30 years for that change to take place. My parents were from Michigan, and
your parents were
my
what?
parents were from Michigan, and they came to the University of Pittsburgh to do their graduate degrees, and they just never left. So I was my sister and I are the only branch of our family who was from Pittsburgh. Everybody else was from Michigan or from somewhere else. And my dad was a speech professor at Penn State for many years, and my mom was a teacher. And then when I was 8 years old, this was very strange, she announced that she had been called by God into the ministry when I was 8. And so suddenly she's...
So like into a Christian church?
Yeah, she went to seminary, Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, to become a minister. Between the age...
Did she... You made it sound like that was out of the blue. Was she religious prior to this?
Well, I mean, they had always taken me to church every week when I was a kid. But, when you're a kid, you can't necessarily make sense of religion. It's just like, this is what you do. You go to church on Sunday, and it's like you sing these songs and you say these words and whatever, but it may or may not actually...
It's not necessarily personal to you.
It may or may not mean anything to you. So all of a sudden, to hear my mom say I've been called by God, it's like, sure. It's like
so you're 8, but even at 8 years old, you were kind of like, that's weird to me.
It kind of was. And all I knew was like my mom went from being available to, like, pretty available to me, to not being very available to me, because now she's going to school full time, and she's she's trying to do all that stuff. And
so this calling of God to you is almost like
taking my mom away a little bit.
Like you interpreted it as like, well, God's this person that keeps my mom from hanging out with me as much.
I just thought the whole thing was very strange. And my dad was an alcoholic. He was abusive. And I think looking back on it, my mom not only was called by God, but I think she also saw that as her ticket out of a bad situation, and to provide a means for taking care of my sister and I. She saw that not just as her life's work and something that was important, but also as a way to escape something that was just not very good. And then my dad, in a last-ditch effort to try to save things with my mom and have things in common with her, he decided to go to seminary as well.
So all of a sudden he's
called by God. And it's like my mom was serving as an associate pastor in one of the biggest Methodist churches in Pittsburgh while my dad is in seminary, and they assigned him to this little podunk church out in the middle of nowhere. And what was very, very...
because I think some people don't know this, but I guess in the Methodist church, right, you just get assigned somewhere. You don't really have a lot
That's right. That's absolutely right. And, the bishop just... meets you and talks to you, and it's a gauge on your personality and your skill set, and then decides where you go. And that's just how it is.
Yeah, my brother and my parents actually both attend a Methodist church, and he really likes the pastor they have right now. And it's like this constant thing he's worried about,
Are they going to move him?
Are they going to move him somewhere else? And then we probably wouldn't like this church so much, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it is a thing that happens. And my mom was very fortunate in that they let her stay where she was for, I want to say 15 years or something. But what was really confusing and interesting at the same time to me was the completely different approaches that my parents had to religion, because, they're both ministers in the United Methodist Church,
And at
different churches, but their approach to it was so completely different. It's like my dad is one of these hellfire brimstone, very judgmental types of Christian who wants to use religion to control and scare people. And I don't align with that like very much.
Because sure. And you said earlier, like, that he kind of like did this whole religion thing to like save his relationship with his mom in some ways.
I think on some level that's true. I think it would be disingenuous to say that he did not feel religion too. I think that is something that was important to him, but I do think that he saw things slipping away with my mom, and I do think that was part of it.
But but you also said he was like previously
to
this like decision to go to seminary and all this. So I just wonder, like, I don't want to speculate too much, but it's interesting that it seems like his preaching and teaching style is also like, bears out those same
kind of. It's just, he was very much thinking that, well, I'm your father, so I'm entitled to knowing everything about you. There was no privacy that I was allowed. It's like he went into my room and read my diary, and I just thought that was so awful. And it's like when I was 19, I got a pap smear, because you do that when you're a young woman. You go and you get yourself taken care of. And I went and got a pap smear, and my doctor sent me a letter with the results of my pap smear in it. And my dad felt entitled to open it and read it. And I'm like, what no. And he's like, well, it's your health and I'm your father, damn it. And I'm like, yeah, but that was not okay, man. That's just not, It's like there's some parts of my health that really are none of your business. And of course, at that point I was 19. So, but yeah, looking at my parents' different brands of religion, it is amazing to me that they ever got close enough together to reproduce, let alone twice. Because my mom, for her part, she's always been very open, very welcoming, and in her ministry, one day it was after church, and there was a guy sitting in the congregation just by himself, and he's crying his eyes out. And she came over to talk to him, and getting to know him, she realized that, this was a gay man who had AIDS. And of course, this is during the AIDS crisis in the 80s. And he had been completely disowned by his family for being gay and for having AIDS. And, getting to know this young man kind of changed my mom's views on a whole lot of things about homosexuality and like the corrective responsibility that she feels like the church has, telling these people that they're wrong or evil or going to hell or whatever. So she wrote a book called More Than Welcome. And it's a book about how the church has a responsibility to help these folks and not hurt them. And the Methodists were not very happy with her for writing this book.
Because right now, like, when did you write it?
About 20 years ago.
That's a big.
She was ahead of her time.
So that was like, because that's a debate going on in the
it really is. And she just retired this year, and she's like, I'm so glad I don't have to have to do the politics on that one anymore. But she ended up leaving that church and going on something called honorable location, which is you can still maintain your ordination as long as you're doing something honorable and, Christ-like, I guess. And so what she did is she served at 4 Unitarian churches instead of Methodist churches. And I think those were a lot closer to where she is theologically, which is just, whatever your journey is, we support that. If you are engaged in a responsible search for truth and meaning in your life, and you're trying to be a good person, then that's awesome. And so
did you like growing up then with this because I've never met anyone who had this kind of religious experience growing up. This is really unique. Like, did you have? I mean, I guess you grew up going to church, so I assume back then you would have thought of yourself like as a Christian.
Well, when you're a
whereas
kid, you don't really
this
think of
is
yourself as anything. It's like you just, it's
right.
time.
It's like, this is
Yeah,
my
it's time for
family. This is what we
church. You
do.
just go to church. But what's interesting to me is all the other preachers' kids who I've ever met in my life, they never knew what it was like for their parent to not be a minister, right? It's like they
Yeah.
were born into a family where there was already a minister. But for me, it was a lot different because suddenly I'm dropped into this fishbowl that's not of my making. And you have all of these folks at church who are suddenly taking an interest in everything you're doing and everything you're saying. And I really didn't like that very much. And we had, my dad was not a good person at that time.
Yeah.
And so to me, it felt very dishonest to have to show up at church and pretend to be the Norman Rockwell family when we had this horrible stuff going on at home. And I really resented that. And people, it always struck me as there was a level of fake going on at church. It's like they weren't necessarily actually interested in each other. They were just maybe there out of some biblical commandment to fellowship with each other. I mean, I'm sure that there were people who it meant something to.
That was your perception of like the church as a whole.
Yeah, that's how it felt.
Not just your
and
parents.
my mom and I used to get into these big arguments because somebody would come up to me and say, "And how are you today?" And I'd say, "Well, I kind of had a bad week. I have a headache today, And my mom would just be like, "Can't you just say fine? They want to hear you say fine. Just say fine." And I'm like, "But Mom, if they want to know how I am, why are they?" Yeah, it's like if you don't want to know how I'm really doing, then why ask? It's like, and if I'm not fine, why should I say that I'm fine? And it's just, so we had this whole thing about that where she was trying to tell me that was part of the niceties of going to church. It's like, it's just kind of like if somebody says good morning, you're supposed to say good morning back. And if somebody says, how are you? You're just supposed to say fine, true or not. And that's just not how I roll. If somebody asks me, how are you doing? I'm going to be like, dude, I just read this horrible thing on the internet and I'm kind of upset today, and
yeah, no, I really appreciate you sharing this because I think there's a lot of Christians who listen to this podcast because we get into these kind of discussions. And I think you've hit on something that's like there's been a lot of ink spilled over this issue, but seems like there's an exodus from a lot of churches these days. Like churches are not really growing. And actually a lot of like mainline Protestant churches are not growing. And, I think, not to say that we've pinpointed it here, but this is one of the reasons, like people come and they don't feel like there's this freedom to say, I'm not okay. And, I think that's a really important message for us for Christians. Like I'm actually, you probably gathered this by now, but I profess to be a Christian. And so like, yeah, I really want to think like, how can we make church this place that doesn't feel like a show or like a masquerade where we're hiding what's really going on.
Well, I do not have a problem with Christian people. I actually admire folks who have something in their lives that gives them hope and gives them meaning. And, there are times when I wish I had faith, because, there's some pretty scary stuff going on in the world right now. And it would be comforting to have that kind of faith. And I can appreciate people for whom that is important. Absolutely. The point at which I have an issue with it is when you got people trying to bully or control or scare other people. I don't think that's cool at all.
Right.
And
it sounds like you got some of that from your some of that was coming from your dad, I guess, growing up, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And I mean, I had other relatives like that too. But I don't know. It was strange because growing up in the church, I looked around at confirmation time, and I looked around at the other people in my confirmation class, and it just felt as though everybody else had something that it meant something to all of these other people, but I was like, what kind of defect is wrong with me that I don't feel this presence of God or love for Jesus that everybody else around me is saying that they do? It's not something that I felt. And there were words in some of the things that we were supposed to read. It's like, they'll be like, let's all read this litany together. And there would be like a couple lines in that litany that I'd be like, oh, I don't agree with that. And it's like, so do you read the litany or do you leave out the stuff that you don't agree with? And it's like, what do you do? And my dad considers it the greatest failure of his life that I rejected the beliefs that I was raised with. But I don't think it's his failure, because it kind of didn't take to begin with. It just didn't resonate. And
certainly doesn't help
that's
that, I'm sure that he was a difficult person to live with.
Well, there's a difference between Christianity resonating and morality resonating. I mean, I like to believe that I know the difference between right and wrong. I like to try to be a good person. I'm teaching my kids to be good people. And I think it's possible to teach others to be good people and to be good people without being religiously affiliated. I do believe in some kind of something that's bigger than we are. I call it the universe. I think that my beliefs, as I've thought about them, are somewhere between Buddhism and paganism, if that makes any sense at all. Collective consciousness and interdependence. And powers of the universe. I do think that there is something after death. I don't believe in heaven or hell, because I think that if there's a God, God would love us too much to send us to a place like hell. I just think it's a transition to another kind of being. I don't know if I'm right or not. I just know that it's important for me to try to be a good person and try to leave the world better than I found it. And that's what I'm trying to teach my kids how to do too.
So you mentioned earlier, sometimes the idea of hope that's found in Christianity appeals to you. And then you also mentioned, you mentioned just now, this desire to be a good person. I'm curious, where that's rooted for you, or do you have a sense of where that comes from for you now, since it's not necessarily the religion of your upbringing, which you've decided isn't for you and is not something great?
No, I think it has more to do with people whose life work that have inspired me. People I want to be like. I think about people like Gandhi, like Martin Luther King, people who have really put some stuff on the line in order to do the right thing in times when it was hard. Rosa Parks, she was putting her life in danger. And she did it because it was the right thing to do. And so just looking at examples of amazing human beings in the world has just been very inspiring to me. Like Malala Yousafzai, holy crap, that young woman. Just I will get teary talking about her because she's just amazing. And there are so many people doing such great things in the world, and I think that it's these other people whose life stories and journeys have inspired me.
So where do you still keep keep up with your mom? What's your relationship with your dad like now?
I talk to him maybe once a year. My uncle died recently.
Is he still a pastor?
Well, now he's retired and he's in Florida, and so now what he'll do is he'll do a volunteer pastor for people who are in retirement places and they need somebody to lead the service, so he'll kind of do that. My uncle, his brother died recently, and so I was in touch with him, in the aftermath of that, but we don't talk a whole lot. And that has to do mostly with the fact that he very much, when he hears something that's wrong with my life, he will want to fix it, and he will give me advice on how I should fix it. And often it is like the most inappropriate advice. It's advice that might work if he were in the situation, but it is not advice that would ever work for me. And so I've learned to just not tell him anything that's ever wrong about my life. And that's okay. Like, hey, Dad, if you're listening to the podcast, I'm jobless right now. Like, he doesn't know that. My mom knows it, but my dad doesn't, because, I just really not want him to be telling me what kind of job I need to go get now. Or, well, your sister's a vice president and she makes this much money. Thanks,
gosh.
Dad.
Yeah. Oh, man. I'll just go ahead and apologize in advance if he does listen to this podcast, and then you get a bunch of unsolicited advice.
No, you know what? He can kind of barely email. I don't think that podcasts are
unlikely
something that he can do. Like, his technical expertise is probably not at the level of podcast. My mom, though, my mom, on the other hand, man, she's like Instagramming and ziplining and all kinds.
Wow,
stuff.
I don't even know what ziplining is.
Really? It is where you take it's an incline with a cord.
Oh, that kind of ziplining. I assumed you said Instagram and then ziplining. I thought it was some kind of new social thing.
No, no, she is. My mom
Actual
is.
ziplining.
She's 74. Okay. Yeah, she's 74 years old, and she's going ziplining and
that's great.
Trekking through jungles in Africa and all kinds of stuff.
That's great.
My mom's a badass.
Sounds like a interesting person for sure. That's cool.
Yeah, she really is. Cool. She really is. But now that she's retired from the clergy, though, it's really interesting to watch her, because she doesn't want anyone in her retirement community to know that she's a retired minister.
Yeah.
Because
they won't want to be
she's
her friend,
like then. Well, they'll all want to be her friend, but they'll all want to drag her to church, and they'll all want her to pray with them. And she's like, "I spent 35 years doing that. I just want to have some fun now." And so, I'll be calling her up, and she'll be like drinking mimosas and going kayaking and just doing all that stuff.
Funny.
And they don't know, like, her neighbors don't even know that she's a minister.
Yeah, that's
because
great.
she doesn't want that to color. Their opinion of her.
Yeah,
and I can understand.
I get it. I used to be a pastor, actually, and it was always kind of like, I always got a little. And this is some of my own insecurities, probably, but you always get a little nervous telling someone when they ask, like, "Hey, what?" You have that like you sit down with somebody on a plane flight or whatever, I'd always get a little nervous because I'm like, oh, great. Now they're going to hear I'm a pastor and think that they can't like talk to me like a normal human being, or like expect you to have answers to all these things. Like, I went to seminary and I studied about like theology and stuff. That doesn't mean I'm an expert on everything. Like, I'm sorry, I can't help you. But anyway, my wife found this book it's just quotes from Mr. Rogers.
Oh yeah. I have that book.
Okay. Yeah. About parenting. And we're like, it's so like inspiring, like, it just makes me want to be a better dad. It's a really great little book.
Yeah, it really was. So
have you seen the new documentary?
No, I have not. Okay. I've heard that it is amazing, but everyone of my friends who's seen it said that they were, because this is Pittsburgh, he was from here. Yeah. He was a fixture here, and they're filming a biopic about him right now where Tom Hanks is going to be starring as Mr. Rogers. And so Tom Hanks has been popping up all over town, which is pretty cool. But
that is cool.
Everybody I know who saw that movie said that they were just sobbing. And I don't, I love Mr. Rogers, but I don't. The church that my dad was serving, there is not a person in the church who is younger than about 70 years old. And so what I used to do to amuse myself is I would take songs off of the radio and play them really, really slow and churchy and nobody ever knew the difference because these are people who would never be listening to B94 radio. So, and it's like I would tell my friends that I would do this, and they didn't believe me. And so, my dad was like, "Oh, honey, I think it's so wonderful that all your friends are visiting at church." And like the only reason they were visiting at church was to hear what I was doing. And they'd be sitting back there laughing, and my dad wouldn't know why. It's like, well, that's because I just played something by Survivor in the middle of church,
I definitely encourage our listeners out there, go hire Heidi to do some work for your studio. Pretty sure some BioWare execs listen to us.
My God. They're going to be like,
we'll make that happen.
They're going to be like, oh my God, that lady. Because, they've all heard of the stuff that I've done about Dragon Age and things like that. And sometimes when I've met Dragon Age people, I've fangirled a little bit too much. So they're probably going to be like, oh God, not that lady,
Not her again.
There's the famous David Gator over Squee incident of 2013 where I just, I met the guy and I was just like, blah, 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 and then there was a guy standing there, and so this gator walks away, and I turn to the guy next to me and I'm like, dude, did I just mess that up as badly as I think I did? And he went, oh yeah.
He was honest.
Yeah. So if I ever, I have not bumped into him at any point since, but I've decided that I owe him a cup of coffee or something, because that was back when I was a noob and I didn't know how to act. Like just last year at GDC, I ended up on a panel with Mike Laidlaw, and I was like trying not to crap myself the whole time because I'm like, I just want to talk to you about Dragon Age forever. Yeah, he was.
Did that one go better at least?
Yeah, he was a really nice guy, and I appreciated it. Yeah,
that's cool.
Fun times.
Well, where can people find you on? Yeah, where can people find you online?
Actually, I have a website, but I've down because I need to redo it right now, but it's going to be www.deathbow.com. Twitter, just do searches of my name, Heidi McDonald, or Deathbow. It's on Twitter. It's @death_bow, because Deathbow is kind of like my gamer tag. It's my thing. So
cool. Nice.
And Facebook. I'm on all of the stuff.
All the social medias. Gotcha. Cool.
And if anybody wants to talk to me about Dragon Age, I'm always down to do that.
Just set you up on Twitter, and we'll get you
going.
Cool. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm Dridixon82. You can also follow Love Thy Nerd on all the social medias. Just search for @LoveThyNerd. We're @LoveThyNerd on Instagram and Twitter, and then just search for Love Thy Nerd on Facebook. We also have a community called Love Thy Nerd Community on Facebook, where you can go and geek out or nerd out over all kinds of geeky and nerdy things. We have a whole podcast network. So this is just one of 3 podcasts that we produce. We also have Free Play, which covers all areas of nerddom. And then we have The Pull List, which is a comic book podcast. So go check those out. Please go rate and review this podcast on iTunes, and tell your friends about it on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just spread the word about this podcast. That's really the primary way we have of advertising for this. If you'll go rate and review our podcast, send me a note, drew@lovethynerd.com, and I'll see if I can't hook you up with a free game code from a game that one of our guests has made. So definitely go do that and let me know that you did it. And other than that, I think that's about it for us here today. Be sure to go check out lovethynerd.com for great interviews and features and educational pieces about gaming and nerd culture. Go check out, go follow Heidi on Twitter and check out what she's doing. So thanks again, Heidi. This was great.